they would use WhatsApp in a crisis. But here, people would seem less likely to do so. Some say that maybe they would. All right, well, that's good. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to stop sharing that. I'm now going to move on and invite Richard to join us because he has a cautionary tale for us, I think, about a major retailer who used WhatsApp. And I think the story hopefully will illustrate a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. Richard, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Great pleasure to do this online, and thanks everybody for joining us. Stories are good. We love stories. We tell stories, they engage us. And I think it's a lot better for us to explain how things work in the real world. So this story is about a major retailer, a British retailer that's got a very large store on one of the most prestigious streets in London. And they had come across a number of WhatsApp groups, and they decided to do a survey on their company. And they found that there were 36 live WhatsApp groups running. That's the first time they knew that. They then dug down and investigated who was setting up these groups, who was actually managing them, how they were being run. And the result of the study was that these groups were using, having discussions which were quite confidential to the company. A lot of this was about what stock policies they'd have, what maybe buying lines they would have, and a lot of things that you'd say should be information that was kept purely internal. What was the big light bulb moment about having to change things was when they discovered that a lot of the people that were in these WhatsApp groups had actually left the company. And they realized that they were in fact leaking information out to people who'd left, and some of those people who'd left were now working for other stores on the same high street up the road. So they hadn't actually removed themselves from the WhatsApp group, and they were still in there. So that meant that the directors then immediately started a project to say, well, we can't just say don't use it because, you know, people have got used to it. So they hunted around for a solution that would in fact replace what they were doing before they actually made sure that it was completely banned. So that's just a story about a particular retailer, but the same thing happens pretty well across all businesses. That little poll that we did beforehand shows that a lot of people aren't using it, but amongst the millennials there is a sort of belief that things like WhatsApp should be used in businesses. And a number of surveys recently done, particularly by the Chartered Institute of Professional Development, have shown that as much, in some companies, as much as 80% of the companies they've surveyed are using WhatsApp in some form inside their business. So we're talking about today about crisis communications, but some of the points I'm going to raise here resonates about the overall use of it as a business tool. So obviously the title is The Perils of WhatsApp. So the corporate oversight issue, which was the one I was talking about by this large retailer, is that they actually did not have any idea about what was actually running in these discussions, or in fact, how many discussions were running. So the point about any communication systems that you sanction within an organization is that you need to have control over what is actually being discussed and which groups are set up. So the reason we do that, because, for example, we have corporate email, which is still, if you like, the heavy lifting of corporate communications. However, that means that there is a right that every employer has to go back and look at the discussions on the email. So there is an audit trail of what's actually happened, and you commit the company to those things. So if you have a WhatsApp group, for example, these are set up as private accounts. And therefore, there is no control over who's members of those accounts. And pretty well anybody who set that up, either the person who set it up or who they've appointed as an administrator on that account, can invite other people to join that account. Now that could be somebody inside the company, or it could be outside the company. But more importantly, it is the issue is it's not connected to your HR database. So point number 3 is that there is no control over joiners and leavers. Now, anybody who's undergone the processes of ISO 27001, which is in fact increasingly being adopted as a measure of good practice, and particularly on if you like, control of data and cyber, knows that the processes that you have to go through for joiners and leavers is that you have, particularly leavers, the protocols you have to remove them all from the access that they have to various parts of the IT systems that you want to have. And that is very, very important process and protocols you have to go through. In the case where you have sanctioned the use of a WhatsApp group, there is no visibility or no ability for the company to remove you from that group. So that's a very important point when it comes to the conforming, if you like, to company policies. And because they're private accounts, right, there is no usable audit trail. And because it's WhatsApp, is that there is no record that is in fact company of what's actually been said. So what you've got is a situation where the WhatsApp actually only keeps the data or the conversation on their servers for 30 days in an encrypted form, and then it's removed. And anything that you have on your phone is in fact in the cache of your phone, all right, for that things, but it's not actually stored. And if you want to store the conversations, then you have to store it on other types of backup like the iCloud or Google Drive. But that's your decision, and it's nothing to do with the company.
So the data is deleted after 30 days unless it's stored elsewhere. Yeah. But you remain part of the group.
Yes, you remain part of the group. What, of course, is not covered is there's no audit of users that have deleted messages. All right. So if you have the ability to delete message, that actually has an impact on emergencies and crises, because if you have a retrospective on a crisis, you're looking at saying what actually happened. You need to have a complete audit trail to say, what were the instructions that I sent out to this person to do? Now, if that ever ended up in an investigation by either a regulator or courts, you need to be able to prove what actually actions you took and what instructions you sent out. By using WhatsApp to send instructions, you actually don't have any record of that. Yeah. So, for example, the Financial Conduct Authority will require a report of a major incident from anybody that is in fact covered by their regulations. And constructing that report will be very difficult when in fact you have potentially large chunks missing of information. Sure. And even worse, if that somebody did actually die in a crisis and you have to present yourself to a coroner's court, you have not the right level of data or documentation. So using WhatsApp as something that you sanction is a real major problem. Now, the unencrypted backups point, I was talked a little bit a while ago about that you do have the option on WhatsApp to back up to iCloud or back up to Google Docs. They allow you to do that. But remember that those are unencrypted backups. So when everybody believes that you have end-to-end encryptions, the backups themselves that you're doing are obviously from the conversations and they are not encrypted. All right? So the security implications then for the company from your ability to comply with your GDPR requirements is in fact potentially at a breach there.
Well, so, I think this is actually where we want to go next, is on privacy and GDPR.
Yes, well, obviously we are now in the GDPR world, and some people believe that GDPR hasn't really had the teeth or had the impact that everybody thought it was. But it certainly isn't the millennium bug that never happened. This, in fact, is something where there are companies being fined.
Well, British Airways is a good example.
British Airways is one thing, but actually they're the big headlines. But Jim, if you look at some of the other things. There are companies being fined 20,000, 30,000, etc. on a regular basis, smaller companies that are not making the big news. But basically, we're now seeing the teeth of the ICO.
So those smaller companies, they will have lost client data, or
they will, yes, yeah. They will have. And what we're now seeing, and British Airways one is an interesting one, is it's not so much that the cost of the data. It's the question about the competence in British Airways case of the IT staff. Okay, and that's a new thing, because we generally have talked about the GDPR being about the data protection officer and the processes here. Mm-hmm. But in the case of British Airways, we had a situation where they ran a promotion on their site, which the website and the ability to pay was actually hacked.
Yes.
And so they were fined for the fact is they hadn't done their proper testing and due diligence, and the fine was increased on the type of code they put on the website. Now that's of course sent a chill through all the IT directors and everything else to think that these things they do on the website.
Because it was a third party
Yes, it was third party, yeah. But they actually used code that was vulnerable on the website. They didn't manage to check it, and therefore they would be fined for that area. But if we look at, we've got up on the screen now, and you're talking about WhatsApp for Business and standard WhatsApp. There is WhatsApp for Business, and therefore you'd say, well, surely that's fine. But if you want a business type of product, you need to have one where you've got administration control from the center. And WhatsApp for Business deals a little differently with how data is. If you look at the terms and conditions of both of those products, the standard one and WhatsApp for Business, in the standard WhatsApp, you have WhatsApp acting as both what's called the data controller and the data processor. And the way that GDPR works is that the controller is the person who says, I am deciding what data I'm going to put on there, and I am going to be controlling that and talking to the client, whereas the processor is just the repository, and I'm going to make sure it keeps safe and runs on my servers correctly. So, but in the case of standard WhatsApp, they are both the controller and the processor. And by being controller, they are completely at liberty to use the data that you've actually then put up on their servers for whatever purposes they wish to use it for. So they're in complete control. Now, when you join any social media site, the first thing will pop up is to say, I want access to your address book. You know, can I move your contacts directory? Now, as soon as you do that, then that data, many of which will be company contacts, many of which will be client contacts, those are all covered under GDPR. So as soon as you click that, it moves up to WhatsApp. You've actually breached GDPR.
Richard, can I just interrupt you? Brendan is calling from Australia, and he's a bit concerned about some of our acronyms, the first one being GDPR.
Right.
Can you, in very short order, just explain what GDPR is?
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't know whether it's heading your way to Australia, but across the whole of the European Union, we have something called the General Data Protection Regulation. And that has been adopted across all the countries. And this is actually a toughening up of the way in which companies can use data. And it's a sort of general trend around the world where there's been so much of a sort of almost an unwritten contract, particularly between social media companies that say, I'm going to give you this fabulous free service, and in return, you're going to give me your data for me to sell you stuff and do stuff. Well, the looseness of that arrangement has largely been tightened up by GDPR. And so we have been having this since back in May 2018. And this has meant that we've had to tighten up a lot of the way we can operate. And there are things more or less centered on the individual, where the individual have things like the right to be forgotten. In other words, if you're holding data on an individual, then that individual can demand that you remove it. So there's lots of capabilities in IT that companies have had to adopt in order to comply with GDPR.
And just one other thing very quickly, Richard. The other thing is that if you suffer a cyber attack or a data breach, you have to report it. I mean, it's pretty hard to cover this stuff up these days, but you're obliged to report it.
Yes, and that's the teeth of things. You have 72 hours to report it to the ICO, and you can be fined up to 4% of your global turnover. And that's a pretty frightening number for things. And generally speaking, though, if you follow the processes and you do all the type of normal housekeeping to protect the data, your fine is likely to be very small. And but if you don't, and you don't report it, then in fact it escalates very fast.
Just one thing, Richard. Brendan says they don't have, I don't know what they have in Australia, but the GDPR is relatively similar to what they have in the States. Is that right?
Yes, and it's like to get a bit tougher.
Right.
So I think some parts of the regulations of the States are very tough indeed for things. But I think the States are certainly passing laws which are going to probably equal or exceed GDPR in the future, and we'd expect Australia to be taking a similar view. Remember, Australia has taken an extremely strong view about WhatsApp and some of the other social media sites, demanding, for example, that they do have access to WhatsApp. And that's one of the countries that really wants to get control of that conversation. So I think we can only see Australia just following suit over time. But going back to the business one, just very quickly, not to get too nerdish, but the business one merely means that you are the controller as a business of who you've got in your contacts database, and they are just the processor. But if you read the terms and conditions, it says very clearly that you have to have full legal authority from everybody in your contacts book that you are allowing them to share it with WhatsApp. And the reality is nobody does have that. So the get out for WhatsApp is that they have that written information there, but the practical world is that nobody does that. Now, the rules are that the data protection officer in each company must be able to recover that data. And because you've got a private account, that DPO has no view on that. All right. So therefore, that's a big leakage to WhatsApp. And the other thing is about if you decide to sanction it within the company, is that the user data is actually being shared with Facebook. So not the encrypted message, but the fact is you are going to be doing that. And we're going to be shortly seeing adverts appearing in the profile information on WhatsApp. You have to remember that Facebook paid a ton of money for WhatsApp, right, which was not loss-making business. Right. So, and the only way in which Facebook actually justifies this thing is data on you. And they have loads of users. So Facebook will be using it. Now, they may not see the message initially, but they will actually talk about you, Jim, using the system, and they will connect that with other elements.
And then they'll start selling me stuff, won't they?
Yes.
I know they will.
There's a very interesting story, where a person that I know who's actually written a rather good article on the technique, where he met a colleague, a work colleague, who they shared the details of each other on WhatsApp, and she made 2 or 3 messages on WhatsApp. About a week later, he received on his Facebook account a suggestion to connect to the same lady. Right? Now, if each one of those WhatsApp and Facebook are actually supposed to be ring-fenced, but that isn't the case. Right? So there is clearly that Facebook has to monetize these things properly. And that's the issue. So the data about you is going to be shared with Facebook information. So we know that, okay? So let's look at another issue.
Yeah, I think what we're going to look at is sort of slightly hinted at with the Australian experience. But these are kind of other concerns about where WhatsApp may be banned in certain countries, which if it was suddenly, but you were using it in a crisis situation, and it was suddenly when it was banned, then that could cause you some problems. Richard, go ahead.
I mean, this is the thing about this is just the problem of being such a popular platform that's being used, is that you face the fact is that it could be turned off at any moment. I mean, if you think about the success of WhatsApp, WhatsApp now in India, for example, is up to 400 million users of WhatsApp, which is just fantastic.
But the whole thing is more than 1 billion users, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
It's huge.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but there's 400 million in India.
Yeah.
And so therefore, when, for example, in Indonesia, they had a lot of riots there, they immediately disabled the ability for people to share photos and images, etc., because they realized that was fueling the riot. Now, if you happen to be in Indonesia or have a company there, then in fact, your ability to use it in the emergency exactly for what you want to do, is to try and report the situation, immediately fails. And in some countries, you know, like UAE, for example, and for Russia or China or in everything, other places, it is just not feasible. Now, we're sitting in nice UK, which we're nice and friendly, but we've got to remember is that if we're going to use it for crisis, and we may have executives sitting in other countries, and you can't actually...
And they just flick the switch and it goes.
And it goes on. So that's one of the other concerns. And I think
sorry,
probably the other big thing that's sort of happened is that the marketing of WhatsApp has been that it's end-to-end encryption, right? Which sounds fabulous.
Yeah, it does, and particularly for crisis.
Absolutely, it's fantastic. And I think that encryption is such an important part of the security we have to do with our data now. So everything we do, for example, is always what we call encrypted at rest. That means everything on servers is encrypted. So if someone did hack the server, they're only dealing with encrypted data. And you always encrypt over the wire. That means when things are being sent to devices, it's encrypted over the wire, just like what WhatsApp is doing. Fine. But when you want to read it, Jim, you can't read encrypted data.
No, right.
So the phone or the operating system then converts the encrypted data into readable text. Right? At that stage, the message is vulnerable, right? And it was, you know, in the sort of the stories about Trump, etc., and some of the people that were engaged around his circle, they felt that WhatsApp, of course, was a secure way of communicating, but they were forgetting that the end recipient was actually copying all the messages,
and
then produce those in court. So people forget that point. But more importantly is that the ability to hack, not necessarily the WhatsApp itself, but the operating system to read those messages is the vulnerability.
This Israeli company?
Yeah.
Okay.
So NBC it was, which is a company that prides themselves on selling a military-grade version, and they sell it to what they claim to be only people who are...
military-grade version of what, so to be clear?
Military-grade of a hacking software.
Right.
You know? And in fact, the Israelis government classifies that bit of software as a weapon, right? And they sold it to a number of actors out there. And they then managed to use it to access what I think now is about 1,400 accounts of very important people. And particularly going back to India again, there is a strong suspicion in India, and the government has been accused, Modi has been, of having this software and spying on the main opposition and human rights people in India. So even if they haven't, now the suspicion is that WhatsApp is vulnerable, that who else has actually been using the software.
So just to be clear about this as well, so it's not hacking the encrypted material, it's just looking at what is on somebody's phone.
Yes, in the case of this software, this was delivered. You see, WhatsApp is a messaging system, but it also is a voice system, and it uses VoIP, voice over IP. And as its method of talking, that's why it costs nothing to talk on WhatsApp. But that's just computer software, and that's able to deliver packages of malware, right? So they packaged up so that if anybody made a call or they called the phone, it then put this malware onto your phone, into your operating system, which would actually then view what you're talking about and then send that back to their servers. So that meant that suddenly we were all thinking that, you know, WhatsApp is nice and secure, and suddenly we find that this software has a very clever way of doing it. And so now people are nervous about those types of conversations. But so you can't, even in a crisis, is that we have to say is that the vulnerability of the people you're talking to could be that there is some spyware on their phones that is actually showing them what you're talking about and what you're discussing on that area. Now, that only probably impacts major crisis where major decisions are being made, but we have to be careful when we've got a ubiquitous piece of software. The problem with that ubiquity is that it encourages really smart hackers to invest the time to develop very smart software. There is no payback for a small little program that you want to start trying to hack, but a big platform like WhatsApp gets a big payback for hackers. And that's one of the problems with being a big platform.
That it's worth people.
Yeah, and that was the problem with Microsoft for so many years. I mean, Microsoft was the leading player and therefore had so many bits of malware attacking it. And Apple got away fairly well, but not necessarily because they were that much better, but because they were much smaller. And that's the nature of it. So we have to remember that.
Okay, good. Well, I think you've got another story for us. And this is not so much from the technical perspective, but from the HR, human resources perspective.
Yes.
Tell us about this one.
Well, the one thing that's happened is that we've seen these chat tools starting to pervade businesses, and as we've said, this is sort of fairly in an uncontrolled way. So there have been now the blurring of the line between what's actually in the business and what's actually your private area is a problem. And it became particularly clear when we had a trader in the City of London, and this actually went through the court cases. But an investment banker was fined £37,000 by the Finance Conduct Authority, who shared information to a friend over WhatsApp. And that is because it's so easy. The barrier to say, I'm using WhatsApp for talking on my business, and then I, in fact, go to my private life and shared it out. He was so excited about potentially having a deal. He was saying that he was going to pay off his mortgage, right? Then, in fact, he shared the details of the deal with friends outside WhatsApp. Right. And because there's no physical barrier, it's about almost like having particularly a fence that you've now taken down, but it's marked with nice little cones, and you're saying, don't cross that particular line. There's no fence there anymore. And the point is that between the use in business and private, it's very easy for people to stray across the line. And so that's the problem of having a tool that is actually built for the family and friends world and in business. So in that case, and this is not the first time, and there has been many cases where the issues have been taken to court. In some cases, there's been discrimination, and in many cases, what's happened on WhatsApp is exactly the same in a business as happened in the rest of social media, which is the issue of bullying and the issue of sexual harassment, etc. For that. So so there is a concern, particularly even within a crisis, is that when people are under a lot of pressure and a lot of tension, etc., that what's actually then communicated down the line to people, it's inappropriate, and as people would say, often first thought. Now whatever's been communicated can be then removed. Actually, from a company, we do need to deal with that and not deal with hearsay, and therefore we do need an audit trail. And so when these stories come out about people sharing inappropriate data, the Met Police have had a number of court cases against them where groups of the Met Police were sharing images and things which were totally inappropriate. It's just too easy because they don't have any corporate oversight, and because they know nobody's looking at it, that encourages that type of behavior. Right. And you don't use your corporate email for that because you know that somebody could actually trawl through that and bring that information up. So you are careful what you say.
But whereas with WhatsApp, if you can't be seen, if there's no corporate oversight,
absolutely encourages the wrong type of behavior.
And of course, it encourages. I guess we all learned years ago with email, when it's so easy to fire off an email. Most people now sort of think twice before doing that. But it's even easier with some sort of messaging service, whether it be Messenger or WhatsApp or whatever it is, just to bang something out like that and then live to regret it later, as your guy did with the fine that he didn't pay off his mortgage, I guess.
Absolutely.
All right, we're going to move on now, and all right. Well, here's the thing, Richard. You've been a bit combative with WhatsApp. But clearly, there's a role for chat in a crisis, isn't there?
No, I think what is, if you look back, get up in the helicopter, look at the trends of communication, and we've been looking at, obviously, as I said, email is the backbone of corporate communications at the moment. But then we've also got SMS, and SMS is sort of sending a message, which is people have found pretty useful. But the chat is different, and chat has actually become part of our lives. And that is the immediacy of having the response and being able to share information.
That's the upside.
Images.
Yeah,
It's the upside. And no matter what we say, is that it's actually a very, very useful tool. And I tell you, in a crisis, that immediacy could be vital and it could actually save lives. So whereas you can use SMS, for example, as we do in mass notification, to tell people that there is a crisis. But if you're trying to resolve a crisis amongst a team, a collaborative solution where people are suggesting ideas and sharing data is a very good way to do that. And so we've seen a fabulous tool arriving, but the issue is that you cannot compromise the legal requirements within a company. So we see it as a very good tool, and we see that obviously it's mobile. We have now, certainly in the UK, I think amongst people in business, we have about a 96% of people using smartphones. There's only a few people holding out for the old ones.
Nokia bricks.
Nokia bricks or something. And they're generally people who are flat earthers or people who don't want to get hacked. So those people, have got a very powerful computer in their pocket, and they're using it all the time. And because they're all the time, that enables us to use chat tools in a very collaborative way. The immediacy of being able to get an answer. I was talking to a crisis person, and he was talking about his own personal crisis, which wasn't exactly really a crisis, but he was a complete, had a Lancia Stratos. Right,
what's that?
Very fast rally car.
Okay, I don't think everybody.
Brilliant rally car.
All right, okay.
But I would say you have to take a bit of a risk if you did what he did, was to take it up on a tour through the sort of Norwegian fjords and the mountains, etc. Okay. And of course, the thing broke down, and the only person who knew how to fix this Lancia Stratos was sitting somewhere in the UK, and therefore they could use WhatsApp to take the photograph, take the filter, tell him what to do, everything else. And there was no way that a Norwegian person would be able to do it because it's a car you would never normally come across. So that was where the immediacy of how to get the car back again was an example of how you could fix something by a collaborative work with someone.
Where chat came in.
And you could share the image, and the person could say, all right, tighten this bolt, do this. And that is an example of how you can solve things by collaboration, right? And the other thing that's become pretty familiar to us now, and that's really important for adopting. We're all now used to it. The adoption is, over 1 billion users, etc. of WhatsApp. But if you add Facebook Messenger in there, all the other chat facilities, Slack, everything else. And I think from a crisis point of view, is that getting the images and the videos and the docs. What if you're in a crisis commanding role? You will be wanting to say, I want to have that image. What's going on the actual problem itself. You may have spotters on site. We can then send you back images or share images, share videos, and you may have documents you want to share immediately about, how to fix things, or things where you can share with people, or installation manuals that you wish to do so, in order to fix things, how to turn off the gas main, etc. These things make it a very, very useful tool in a crisis. Okay, so that's all the plus side of what's a product like WhatsApp can actually bring.
Okay, good.
So we think it's really good in a crisis.
So let's move on a little bit. So what about the future? You're always looking at where all this is going. So where do you see it going? How do you see crisis communication changing in the next few years? Where's that going?
Yeah, well, I think the phrase here I'm using is multi-pipe, but it could be multi-channel communications, which is what we want to do. I think that where we are communicating, and this particularly affects where we are communicating around the world, SMS, for example, which for crisis communications is the main way that companies tend to sort of push out notifications by text to people. they run through the telecom networks, okay? And most of those telephone networks around the world are run by or managed by government agencies. And they are very precious, and they set the rules, and they have various ways of working. So it's a bit of a train wreck out there in the world of getting a message through all these different organizations and making sure that you're sending it according to the various rules that are set up in each particular country. So you can't rely totally on SMS communications or even voice communications around the world. So you need to use the internet as well. Okay, so we're seeing that rolling out. So not just that, but also you're sending out by in-app messaging, where they're getting just the same sort of push notifications as you would do on WhatsApp to tell you information, but also email. And I think that what in crisis communications, we are now dealing with the biggest threat that we have to everybody, really, is cyber attacks. And in cyber attacks, generally speaking, you can say that they have been in your system for 100 days or so. And the triggering of a cyber attack is generally done to cause maximum mayhem at the point where it's just before a public holiday or just before the weekend.
Right. Yeah.
And so you can assume that your communication system will be compromised. And you therefore have to be very careful about using your own systems for saying how you're going to fix it. So we've had many cases of cyber attacks and ransomware attacks where people are fixing it by using their corporate email to communicate how they're going to fix it. And the hackers are merely just reading the emails and then responding accordingly. So you have to have multi-pipe communications, but independent communication, right? Better tools at the edge. We've somewhat talked about that, but we see crisis communications obviously starts off along the command and control model, you know, the pyramid, the top down, the gold, silver, bronze model. But as I think Andy, who's on the call actually on this thing, said, he used to be the PwC, one of his models is to look at this pyramid and say, actually very soon that pyramid inverts itself, so that in fact the people at the center are supporting the bronze teams who are fixing the problem.
Right.
And that's what we describe as the edge. That's the edge. Now, for you to fix the problem, the center has told you that the problem exists by the communication tools that we have. But at the edge, you need these collaboration tools, very much like we've talked about, that ability to chat. So a group of people who are the fixers now have the ability to communicate amongst themselves about the best way to solve the problem. And most of the knowledge of how to solve the problem isn't at the center, it's actually at the edge. So better tools at the edge is the way we see it. Collaboration definitely improving. We know that most of the crisis studies that have said what went wrong was a failure of communication and a failure of collaboration. And what we do see is that you've got to present not just the information to say there is a missile heading this way from North Korea to Hawaii as you sit there, but you need to actually not only do that, you have to actually know what to do about it, not just decide you're going to break out the drinks cabinet and things, but you need to know where's your shelter, where's your information, and you have to collaborate with a group of people to actually survive those situations. So collaboration is really part of it. The ad hoc side, the agile nature, there is a tremendous improvement around the world in terms of business continuity work and things. I think that that's been driven by financial services and other areas and other people at risk. But there is now a real understanding that we do need to think very carefully about how we can survive. Driven by a lot of terrorism in Europe, driven by extreme weather, and driven by cyber attacks in particular. But whatever you have as your playbook, so you're expecting, is actually going to be different, all right? And so you need to be able to say, this is what we're going to be using. These are the checklists you will need, but actually we're going to do number 1, number 5, number 6, or we've just put a new one in there. Yeah. So agility is very important to get the right
document handling.
Document handling, checklists, and reporting back systems, etc. All of that exchange is really important as you go through the crisis.
It's sort of starting to make, just the SMS element of this seem quite old-fashioned.
Well, it's very thin. It's just a very small amount of information you can put across. It tells you that, but actually sometimes when people like me who run businesses, we don't particularly like somebody telling us that there's a major problem at 10 o'clock at night just before we're going to sleep when there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. Okay. But if they tell us something and say what the fix is and say what the actions are and more information, the richer information, we sleep better. Okay. Because we know things are being handled. Okay. So what we need is richer information, particularly in a crisis. And one of the other things is that it's not sufficient to have disjointed processes in terms of audit trails. I mean, we're a great believer, passionate and almost compulsive follower of making sure that everything is in fact audited. And that's not just so that we can learn from events, etc., going forward, but also so that in fact, as we say, if we need to produce evidence, we can do. Those people familiar with the police will know that any incident will have a commander, and next to the commander will be a scribe who is writing down what actually we knew at the time and what actions that person took. And so therefore, you are always being able to produce the evidence of the decisions you made. In business and most crises, we don't have the time for that. So whatever systems that are now being adopted in the future have to properly have a full audit trail of everything that is being made.
I mean, certainly from my background in crisis management and so forth, logging your actions and decisions and reason why there's a very good reason why that's part of crisis management protocol, because if you do end up in the court or as an inquiry, you need to be able to explain why you took certain actions. And also it'll help you through a crisis. It's similar to logging just information as it comes in as well. It's all good crisis management practice, essentially.
And privacy, as we've spoken about beforehand, privacy is just going to ramp up. Cyber attacks are going to be stealing more and more information, and people are going to get more concerned. If people stop using tools because they're worried about privacy, then in fact we are going to get less resilient, and we want to make sure that everything that happens in crisis communications is in fact entirely protected and private and secure.
Okay, well, time is going on a bit. We've got a few minutes left. Don't forget to put your questions in if you have any questions for us. We'd love to see those. But let's just move on now. I mean, I think it will come as no surprise to you to learn. And while we're very, very careful not to turn this into advertising, we do offer crisis communication software. And we've learned quite a lot in designing our own software. We've learned quite a lot about what people want, what they're looking for. Do you want to talk about that?
I think sharing the journey. I mean, basically, any operation like ours is about looking for a problem to solve. I mean, a lot of technology people come up with a technology before thinking about actually, am I really solving something important? And you always start from the purpose of what problem is being solved. So our eyes on were very much about just how chat was taking off, for example, and how people were using it and how useful it was. But we then spoke to a lot of people about it. And I would say that so many people we said were reluctant people putting their hands up to say they're using it. And we were finding that I interviewed a head of compliance and risk at a major bank, a very famous bank. And he admitted that he was using it, but I use the phrase admitted because he was making that sort of almost confession about it because he knew it wasn't correct, but he just didn't have a better solution. And so that what we found was that there is actually a real demand for a good compliance solution. So that's what we learned on the journey, that people were using it because it was so useful, but it was compliant. And if those of you familiar with the UK, is that we have a National Health Service here, and about a year and a bit ago, they sort of approved it for use within the National Health Service, and which was heavily criticized by certain people, not including me. But the issue is they just said, look, I know we should, but it works and it could save some lives. This is only there for a temporary situation. They know they have to do it. So our journey was to say, people know that there's got to be a solution that comes along. So we set about to actually look at that. And we responded to the feedback on the basis saying, how can we build something which will have all the encryption that you needed, the end-to-end encryption. But the difference is that it's actually able to put onto servers that are actually have got eyes on by the corporation of those conversations. And could we build something like that that would work well? And could we also have this GDPR thing? And one of the stories we have, we do things for connecting areas of London, for example, Westminster and Victoria and Trafalgar Square, and these areas. And these are areas where we connect sort of 150 businesses where they can all talk to each other using Sentinel. But some of them are retailers, and some of them are things where they like to sort of take a picture of a potential shoplifter or somebody like that.
Oh, right. Okay.
And the problem that they face with GDPR is that if somebody decides to share an image that in fact is not correct or anything else, then that person has a right to be forgotten. So we then have to say, can we build in corporate controls where you can look at things that have been inappropriately shared? It could be a document that maybe has got intellectual property in there that shouldn't be shared. So we had to put in those sort of codes. So we had a whole series of checklists on our big whiteboard when we decided to design this system to say we had to deal with all these problems. And then it also is got to be not just working on a mobile device, whether it be Android or an iOS device, but also in the office environment on the desktop. And that's really important because a lot of people will be accessing from whichever device they want to access it from. It's early days for us. We have it operating very successfully with clients, and they actually love using it. But what we had to also do without actually breaching any of the sort of design protocols of WhatsApp, etc., is make it as familiar as possible for the end user. So it was actually just the same sort of experience, and they could use it with the same ease. And that's where you can replace a product if you've got something that's an ease of use of that. And so from a crisis management point of view, which is where Sentinel is focused on it, we now think that as a tool to complement instant conferencing, where you hook people together without a PIN, where you complement SMS and mass notification, where you complement documents, adding chat into the mix gives you a collaborative tool, which is sort of the best way of working. So the feedback was saying, should we do it? When we looked at it, can we do it? The answer particularly yes. So for the last sort of 6-9 months, our developers have been doing that, and we launched it in beta in October. So it's relatively new, but very promising. And that's the thing.
That's excellent, excellent. Well, we're almost at the end here. There's a quick question from Francis, and I certainly don't know the answer to this, but Richard, maybe you do. A point about GDPR. I believe the right to be forgotten is not an absolute right. I don't know. Do you know about this? Just scratching his head here.
You definitely, as an individual, there are certain situations where you have definitely the right to have that information. For example, if you're providing a service, right, and in order to comply, to deliver that service, you need to have the details on that person. Then you have every right to have that information. However, if someone ends that service, right, they do have the right to ask for that information to be completely removed. Right? So it is a right that's enshrined in the articles of GDPR, and that it can be requested. And the problem for companies and businesses, it's a considerable overhead if everybody starts to be asked to be forgotten, and you have to have process in place. So it adds a lot of cost to the organization. So a lot of software, particularly legacy software, was never written with that in mind. And how to pick out an individual person and remove all traces of them on the system. And very often it's leaked out to other places. So the practical side of right to be forgotten is often it's not practical to be able to do it if it's been passed on to third parties and doing that.
Great, Richard, thank you very much indeed. Well, I hope that's been an informative and interesting discussion for you. Just before we go, I'm being reminded here that to tell you about an event that we're running on the 20th of November in central London, and we're running a breakfast briefing. There'll be some yummy food, I think, on offer as well. But we'll be looking at trends in business continuity, including communication technology. I know I'm running a crisis simulation during the breakfast seminar. And Richard, I think you're going to be running technology.
Yeah, no, it's very exciting. I mean,
okay.
we're going to be unveiling some very interesting tech at this meeting.
Okay, good. And there will be a panel discussion as well. It's in central London. It's in St. James's. It's on the 20th of November. And it's in the morning, fairly early morning. I think now, if you are interested in signing up for this, then please just drop us an email and we'll show you where to sign up. But that, I think, is where we are, in fact, going to sign off. So thank you very much indeed for listening to us. We'll be running another webinar next month. If you have some ideas about webinars that you'd like us to run, then please let us know that. But thank you very much for listening. Goodbye from Richard, and goodbye from me, Jim Preen, as well. So bye-bye now.